Mr. Scott.
Senator Ludlam, you have the call.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Scott and colleagues, for being here. Apologies if you raised this in your opening statement and I was a little bit late in here tonight. You announced late last year, I think, that you would undertake some editorial audits on the impartiality of ABC reporting. Did you address that in your opening statement?
No, I didn't, Senator. They're in the process of being completed, and I expect that they will be released in coming weeks.
What are they and who conducted them?
Yeah. One is into interviews that were conducted during the election campaign of the leaders on radio, and the other one is into coverage of asylum seeker stories on our current affairs programs on television.
Okay.
And we've released the name. We've currently only released the name of one person who's done a review. Another, we'll release the reviews and details of who's completed them, and probably a board response to them in coming weeks.
Okay. And they will be produced for the public?
Yes, they'll be available. They'll be probably put up on our website.
What was your decision to choose those two subjects in particular? You folk get kicked around for being biased in all sorts of domains. Why did you choose those two?
It's a fair question, Senator. I mean, finally the decision was made by the ABC chairman. I discussed these matters with him. If you take a look back over, say, the last 7 or 8 years, the ABC board has received, I think, over a dozen independent reports around different aspects of content over time. Impartiality, fairness and balance, interviews, a range of issues. I think the chairman I felt that we should make sure that the reviews addressed contentious issues or matters of public significance. And so there's almost nothing more important in our national debate than election campaign. And there are very important moments when our leaders the Leader of the Government, Leader of the Opposition, appear on ABC radio to be interviewed in live interview circumstances, either by our current affairs teams or by our local radio team. So that seemed to be a significant issue. It gave us a good sample, and that review is in the process of being finalised. And similarly, clearly, the asylum seeker coverage is a very important one. It's a contentious one, and it's one that some of our leading current affairs programs have come back to time again, and we thought that was a significant one to get an independent look at as well. And I expect we will take on, controversial topics and just have eminent independent people provide the board with some advice on them.
I can understand the metric you might apply to leaders' interviews. You're going to roll some sort of scale over whether they were hostile interviews or biased in one direction or another, so I could see how you could do that. I want to briefly quote George Orwell to you. He's meant to have said, "Journalism is printing what someone else does not want printed, everything else is public relations."
Yes.
If you're taking on something as profoundly important and polarising as a refugee debate, how are you going to apply whether or not you're being too humanitarian or too hardline? Like where would the centre lie?
I think that's a good question, Senator, but they're the decisions that our journalists have to exercise every day, because we have editorial guidelines around, fairness and balance and impartiality. And how do you tell a fair story, a complete story? And so what we've said to the reviewer is, well, here are our guidelines, here are these stories, give us some advice on how you think we've gone.
Okay.
And look, this is, we will see how this process evolves over time. I think the chairman said at the National Press Club we'd look to do about 4 a year.
Yeah.
And I imagine they'll be on a range of topics. But I think we want to take on the important and contentious topics.
You better.
And I think we will learn from this. I think it will be a good learning exercise from our staff and our editorial teams. I'm certainly not expecting that. I expect, as is the case when we do, say, financial audits at the ABC, you often get a report back under a financial audit that says, look, pretty good, but you really should look at these areas, and if you did these things in different ways, maybe you'd get a better performance over time. And if we get that from our editorial reviews, then I think that will be a positive thing for our staff and a positive thing for the reputation of the ABC.
Sure.
I expect that there are probably some out there gleefully waiting for the ABC to conduct a review into itself so they can seize on any negative comment. The thing I would say to them is I welcome the opportunity to share the methodology we're using, share the process they're using. I encourage them to do their own independent reviews and also to release publicly reports on their performance.
Do your commercial competitors conduct these sorts of audits?
I don't believe they do, Senator.
Interesting.
And nor am I aware of them undertaking in the newspaper industry either.
Okay. What do you do about an issue where balance is a problem, where if you propose that every time you put a climate scientist on TV, you find a dissident who disagrees, and thereby provide a false impression of equivalence?
That's not actually what our guidelines say, Senator.
Okay.
There's nothing in our guidelines, and I'm glad you raised it because I think there is a misconception. Nothing in our guidelines says that we've got to pull out a stopwatch and give equal time to every alternative view. Our guidelines are about following the weight of evidence. And so I suppose my feeling on climate science is that we follow the weight of evidence. That's not to say that there won't be times when some people who take a contrary view to the weight of evidence or the consensus of climate scientists get on air, and they should be robustly questioned just the way that the climate scientists are robustly questioned. But we certainly aren't in a situation, Senator, where we're pulling out a stopwatch and drawing a false equivalence on every view. But there are many views in our society where there are robust contentions. And, I suppose asylum seeker is a good example of that. It is, there would be some who would argue a view of, utmost compassion to asylum seekers. There are others who would talk that sovereignty of borders is a very, very important national issue, and part of the ABC's coverage should be to respect and explore all perspectives, to ventilate that debate, and to acknowledge the intelligence of our audience that they will come to their own views on the matter.
All right. Let's come to the efficiency review. You'll be no doubt aware that the ABC is number 50 on the hit list of the Institute of Public Affairs, where the proposal is to break up the ABC and put out to tender each individual function. Do you want to just briefly give us your view on what you think of
in
50?
The broad-minded, open discourse that the ABC encourage, I'd like to point out that the ABC has provided a forum for the Institute of Public Affairs to come on our airwaves and espouse that view.
You do a lot. They're on there an awful lot.
Yeah, they are, Senator, but there are a range of voices. I welcome them. We welcome a range of voices, a range of debate. We welcome you, Senator. And that's kind of what the public broadcaster should do. It should be hosting the debate and hosting the conversation. Okay. However, I can tell you that the IPA's plan would be catastrophic for the media in this country, for public broadcasting in this country, and for our national debate and our national discourse. I meet people around the world who reinforce to me how privileged we are that the Australian public has made this investment in public broadcasting over 80 years, and that you have an institution that to this day 85% of the Australian public believes provides a valuable service. More than 70% of the Australian public watch, listen, log on every week. And that we are providing a host of services that commercial entities would never be in a position to financially deliver, and that we deliver to great quality and integrity and generating the passions of the Australian public. And I think, why would you risk such an extraordinary service on such an experiment? And I think the Australian public would be overwhelming in their dismissal of such a radical move.
Where'd that 85% figure come from, Mr.
It comes from we do an annual news poll survey. News poll independently conducts this research. We report on it extensively in our annual report. And last year the figure was that 85% of the Australian public believe that the ABC provides a very valuable service. And that's a very consistent figure over time. And we operate with great trust of the Australian people and great respect of the Australian people. And we are a classic public good in that respect, Senator. The public like the fact that we are there. Not everybody uses us, but the vast majority of Australians do, all over the country.
I've been fairly critical, as have senators actually right across the political divide, that in the name of efficiency, the ABC's consolidated production capabilities in Sydney pulled a lot of people, a lot of expertise out of places like Hobart and Perth.
Yes.
and I don't propose to go into that debate tonight. It's been well aired, but should I read into a so-called efficiency review that there's likely to be more of that in the pipeline?
Yes, it's a good question, Senator. I don't think we really know. I think Mr Lewis is reviewing the ABC and SBS at the moment. And I suppose what I would say is that if efficiencies can be made for us to deliver the same services at a lower cost, then that would be a good thing to do, and we could take that money and reinvest it in content for ABC audiences. And so we've pursued efficiencies in recent years, and if there are more efficiencies that Mr Lewis can find, that isn't about cutting back quality, isn't about cutting back services, but just delivering the same services at a lower cost, then we'd be interested in that. But I do think, and you'd understand the economics of it, there are economies of scale that come with aggregating in certain locations. And when it, say, comes to doing things like running television studios, there's no doubt you make most efficient use of those television studios by having them operating all day, every day.
Which is not what's happening in Perth.
Which is not what's happening in Perth at the moment. That's true. But it is happening in Sydney, and it's closer in Melbourne. I think Sydney and Melbourne, Senator, I concede that. And we're also trying to make some television production in South Australia. However, what I would say, and I may have said this before you came in, we are committed to making television around the country. We are making documentaries in Western Australia. We're making children's programming in Tasmania. We make programs like Australian Story in Queensland. And we work with the independent production sector to make drama, factual programming all around the country. And we're happy to report on where we're making that programming.
Okay. I want to come to the Australia Network, your view on its purpose and its future, and it would seem to be first on the chopping block, really. In fact, it's been addressed separately and independently of this so-called efficiency review as something that should never have been given to you in the first place and will shortly be knocked over. What might just seek your view on that?
Yeah.
But also what it would do to your global newsroom presence for the purposes of broadcasting into Australia, quite apart from its impacts on our regional footprint.
Okay, thanks for the question. I don't particularly want to go into the tender process.
No,
Senator.
I'm happy to leave that.
We had views on that at the time, and some of that was out of our hands. Sometimes I hear some of the debate around Australia Network, and I think there are three different audiences here, and sometimes there's confusion about who we're delivering it for. We're really not delivering Australia Network for harried business executives slumping in their hotel room in Singapore and wanting a bit of home, and they often want news and footy. Similarly, expats often want news and footy. That's not the audience either. I mean, we're targeting Australia Network under the agreement we have with DFAT. We are targeting the rising middle class of Asia, people who want to learn and master English, people who want to do business with us, people who want to travel here, people who want to send their kids to study here. And that's the target, and that's why the agreement has been on quite a broad array of programming. Some of it entertainment, some of it drama, some of it factual, business, news, English language learning. If you look at the English language learning, the Australia Network, Australia Plus English Language Facebook page went through 1 million friends last week, which is more than the BBC and more than Voice of America.
More than I've got.
So, and well more than I've got too, Senator. So it really is targeting that. And what we've also done in 18 months is recognise that our aim with a converged radio, television and online and mobile service is to create content that we put out on our platforms, but also to put content out there on Indonesian websites, on Chinese websites, to find other television partners to distribute it as well. So we would argue that the strategy we've developed with DFAT, we're actually delivering quite well. We've had significant growth, significant partnerships. Every month it's watched by more than 1.2 million people in Thailand and Malaysia, 3.4 million in India, 1.6 million in the Philippines, and by 6% of the Singaporean population and 22% of the PNG population. And so it has had significant growth. The digital strategy is working, but it's particularly targeting the target that we agreed with DFAT to reach. And so there might be some who say play News 24. There might be some who would say just cater to the expats. That's not been the
That's not
target,
your
and we're
market.
working on the target.
I suggest there's another very important audience that you need to cater to, and that's the IPA in the Murdoch newsrooms, but we'll leave that. That's a comment rather than a question. But could I come significantly to what would it do to your news gathering capabilities for domestic broadcast here in Australia?
It would have some impact, Senator. Some of the Australian network money goes into ABC News, and what we do with that money is we put some extra correspondence around the region, because we are creating content for Australian network as well as content back here. Some of that will end up on News 24, but a lot of it will appear on Australian network. We wouldn't anticipate that we would need to close specific bureaus, but some staff in bureaus would need to be reduced, and the amount of content that we're producing out of the region would be reduced as a consequence of that.
How many?
There'd be less content from Asia available for Australian audiences if Australian network was shrunk back.
Yeah, but are you able to describe in terms either of FTEs or number of hours broadcast, or is
Well,
that too complicated?
Senator, to be truthful, I've read more about commentary of Australian network than I've had detailed discussions with DFAT. The head of ABC International is beginning to have some discussions with DFAT, but we haven't done scenario planning around it. Finally, the decision on Australian network and the ABC's international presence lies with the ABC board. I mean, we are contracted to run Australian network. That contract still has about 9.5 years to run. The ABC, though, has in its charter that we're to be an international broadcaster. So finally, the shape of our international commitment, if a decision was made, I think it'd be a very unfortunate decision was made. If a decision was made for the government to withdraw funding, the ABC would then need to consider what it does.
And just lastly from me, is it your understanding that that commitment is locked in legislation?
Well, what's locked in legislation is if the Australian network is to be delivered, it's to be delivered by the ABC. The ABC is the deliverer of Australian network, and we have a contractual arrangement with DFAT for the delivery of Australian network for 10 years. And there are implications clearly that are involved if DFAT decided that it didn't want to see those 10 years through.
I'll leave it there. Thanks for bringing Rake back.
As promised at the last estimate,
as committed.
Senator.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair.
That will complete